When we plan events and we have programs, you never know what the attendance is going to be. And people ask me, how many people are going to show up? And I said, 50 to 500. It looks a little closer to the 500 mark, maybe 100 short. But thank you everyone for coming out. This is one thing that we've been preaching and talking about all along, is coming out and getting involved, learning, not just behind the keyboard, not just watching TV, not just emailing and looking at friends, but coming here one-on-one like we used to do. So thank you again, a big round of applause for everybody that's here. Thank you. I want to also recognize some of the dignitaries we have here, some of the local town officials, some of the county officials, because they've asked to be educated, and we've all been asked to be educated, and I appreciate you coming out tonight. We have Agent Reggie Johnson from the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office. Thank you. We have Councilwoman Elsie Foster Dublin. Thank you very much. We have Councilman Matt Hale, very instrumental. Councilman Phil George. Councilman Josh Fine. And Mayor, where's the mayor? Oh, we have a seat for you. Come on up, come on. Okay, thank you very much, Mayor. Okay, I had a thing for the security committee. Someone's parked in a non-parking fire zone. Really have to move the car immediately. Does anybody know if they did? We'll get the license plate and announce it if you did. Please move it right away. And also, we want to welcome a 70-woman from the 18th District, Nancy Pinkerton. Thank you very much for coming out. Rabbi Lowe, the head of school of RPRY. And more importantly, thank everybody also for coming out in our group, CJJ PAC, which is an ad hoc group, Central Jersey Jewish Political Affairs Committee. We're just concerned people who live in the community who are looking to help out the community, get involved. And so again, thank you, Rabbi Luban is here from Oratora. And also, Rabbi Kaufman, very instrumental in helping us with all the programming efforts. Please say a couple words, thank you. Rabbi Kaufman from Ohav.
Thank you so much, Michael. And it is for me a great honor and privilege to welcome you to our shul that has the name Emeth. And those who know Hebrew know that Emeth means lovers of truth. And the truth is that we thank everyone for coming and lending support and joining together to confront this difficult issue. And I have to say that there's a sad truth, and that's a reality that a night like tonight is even necessary. Because we thought that this ugliness of anti-Semitism would be a thing of the past, would be all behind us. But the sad truth that to our generation, who still has a living memory of the horrors and atrocities and the stain on human history, that nightmare of the Holocaust, to our community who still have and who are here, I see present, individuals and our outstanding members who lived through that, who are living testimony to the inhumanity of man against man. It is a sad reality that we have to come tonight. And as Michael said, be educated. And the shocking events that occurred in Muncie, together with the horrors in Jersey City and Poway and Pittsburgh and elsewhere, are proof that, unfortunately, this darkness has returned. And as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs former chief rabbi of the UK, and he's world famous. And he's been everywhere. He says that in every country in Europe, there has been a return of this terrible darkness of anti-Semitism. And we thought that we were through with all of this. But as a rabbi in this community for 20 years, proudly, to our lovely borough, this wonderful place, I don't really go anywhere else. I don't get out really, just like Rabbi Sachs. But I never thought that we would be so affected. Our shuls now, our synagogues, our schools, that were our community centers are open, and we're free for people to come and to meet and to join in our prayer, in our learning, are now on a lockdown, and rightfully so. And it's protected now by armed guards, and now boards of our community shuls and yeshivas, our schools, now have to figure out how we're going to pay for it all. So difficult. And we're troubled. We're troubled by the shocking graffiti that's found outside our beloved shul, Congregation of Avas Achem, and reports and incidents perpetrated against our own citizens here in Highland Park. Who would have believed such a thing? And Jewish students in our universities, our local universities, who feel unsafe and at times are targeted by hate, unthinkable hate for no reason. They're scared of wearing a yarmulke. They're scared for young girls to wear a Magen David. And these are sad realities. And I don't remember a time, I don't know if you do, I don't remember a time that we were like this. And it's concerning. It's troubling. It's troubling to all of us. And I'm not telling anything that we all don't know. I'm not saying anything new. I mean, we're all aware of this, and the fact that all of you are here tonight, then you're all aware of it. The fact that we have our mayor who is here shows that she's concerned. Our council members, they're concerned about this. We have a representative from our prosecutor's office. They're concerned about this. And of course, our assemblywoman, she's concerned about this. And we're all concerned about it. My fellow rabbis who are here, my colleagues, that we're all very, very concerned of this reality. And that's why tonight is so very, very important. And we thank you all for coming. That we need evenings like tonight to be given understanding, to be given enlightenment on this terrible reality and how we should confront it, how it manifests itself, how this darkness and ugliness has somehow renewed itself and is lifting up its ugly head. And we have to understand this scourge of anti-Semitism and this evil that is in our midst. So, we thank our featured speaker, who is the foremost expert on this topic, this sorry topic, yet so crucial and critical. And I would like to welcome and thank Mr. Mark Weitzman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who will present to us and to enlighten us and give us a better understanding how to move forward and how to deal with all of this. So again, I thank you on behalf of our synagogue, behalf of our community, my fellow rabbis. We thank all of our political leaders, community leaders that are here, and we thank you all and the wonderful committee that put all of this together. So to introduce our featured speaker, Mr. Weitzman, I turn the microphone over to our evening's chairman, Mr. Michael Gould.
Thank you, Rabbi. Many years ago, I mentioned to our assemblywoman that we met, but it was a crazy night over where the Y used to be. We had a rally supporting the Israeli troops and Israeli soldiers in Gaza. Unfortunately, it was a much-needed relief for people in the community, and you spoke so well then, Assemblywoman Pickett, so thank you very much. And I wonder if you could come up and say a couple words, please.
You know, I don't want to defer from our speaker tonight, so I can
Please.
go after if you want.
No, we put a couple minutes in for you, a couple minutes in for you.
I went from 2 words to a couple minutes. Well, I just want to say, you know, I have been working with Josh Brzezinski for many years on many issues. And this is such a difficult time, and it's a very scary time. And we want to come together, but we want to not turn too inward so that we are losing sight of the whole community. One of the things that I did with Josh was we had the opportunity to go to Israel, and we had interfaith leaders from the Middlesex County come and meet us there. We went with a delegation with the Federation, and we went across the country and interacted with the religious leaders across the country. And it's so important in Middlesex County. We're so diverse. You know, we have Coptic Egyptians, we have Pakistani, we have Indians, we have every different faith imaginable. And many turbulent things are happening across the world, and it's just a very dangerous, scary time. And I think that social media is contributing to this crisis, and the issue of guns is contributing to this crisis. We're really in turmoil. But I think in our county, in Middlesex County, to work together and keep the communication going. It's one thing that I think we've done well. I've been to so many different events where we've had our religious leaders come together with the legislators and talk about how do we struggle ourselves to deal with it, how do we keep the community together, and how do we protect everybody the best we can. And that's what we've been working on. And we need to continue to work on that. I'm always going to continue to work on that. That's why I'm here tonight, and I want to make sure we do that to the best of our ability. And we have worked I've worked on the security grants, both with Josh testifying in committee, adding security to the schools, all of that. It's all necessary. We need to be, I've served on the State Preparedness Task Force. We need to do, I'm not naive to think we don't need everything. We need to do everything we can to protect ourselves and each other. And that's as important as well. So I'm here to help you, and I'm very happy to be having everybody work together and have people from the prosecutor's office and from all of the different townships to work together. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman. Next, we've asked Rabbi Lowe, the head of school of RPRY, to read a letter on behalf of the Jersey City Mayor and of RPRY alumni, Steve Ohav. Please, Rabbi Lowe.
Thank you. As Michael mentioned, I'm Rabbi Daniel Lowe, the head of school of RPRY, Rabbi Pesach Raymond Yeshiva. We have over 300 students from 2-year-olds through 8th grade, right over the border in Edison. We serve Edison, Highland Park, East Brunswick, and other communities. And security, safety, anti-Semitism is certainly very much on the minds of myself, my staff, the entire parent body, and the entire community. And so I'll echo it as well. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you to our elected officials. Mayor Stephen Phillip is the mayor of Jersey City and is also a former RPRY student, so I've been asked to read a letter on his behalf. The letter is entitled Call Out Anti-Semitism Early and Aggressively. There's a growing anti-Semitic sentiment in America and around the world, and it's becoming more emboldened, more out in the open. Sometimes fanned out of ignorance, but more sinisterly fanned on the right and left for political and/or racist agendas. There's no secret about that. I sadly understand there have been issues in Highland Park and across the river in the Rutgers College campus. That's why it is extremely important to call this out early, even the small things, when you see them. In truth, it's a disservice to Judaism, fighting anti-Semitism and hate in general, by not calling it out aggressively and early. I truly believe that if we all take action, we together can bring light into this darkness, as we did in Jersey City. As many of you know, I am part of this story, as well as part of the American dream. I am Jewish, and therefore a target. I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors, which makes it that much more painful. I'm in a sense a member of the Highland Park Edison community, having gone to RPRY. I fought in Iraq, became mayor of Jersey City, and I fight for human rights. Yet I recently experienced a horror in my city. However, as a proud fighting American, I will fight against anti-Semitism and racism, and when I see it, I will not be afraid to call it out aggressively and early. Let me give you more of my background for context. My parents instilled a strong sense of Jewish culture and history in me. 35 members of my mother's family were sent to Auschwitz, and only 7 survived. After World War II, my mother's parents first returned to Romania and then moved to the United States. My father's family also came from Romania, but first settled in Israel, where my father fought to defend Jews in their ancient homeland before coming to the US. My parents, Jewish schooling, and texts guided a lot of my principles and judgment. The Talmud talks about patience and fairness and justice and being a good person and treating people respectfully. And I think that's the foundation I took away from my time in yeshiva. Those are things I try my best to embody in my job. These are also the values I hope to instill in my 1-year-old son. Diversity is not something new for residents of Jersey City, or for that matter, Highland Park or the adjacent Rutgers University. And this incident speaks to the fact that if you can have hate and anti-Semitism in a place that has known diversity and inclusivity since its existence, it should send a message that this sort of sentiment can, and sadly does, exist everywhere. What's most important is that we need to build trust in our communities. But as there are the misguided fueled by misinformation, there is also intentional propaganda, misrepresentations, and misdirections. The prior can be more easily dealt with through education. The latter, be it left or right, framed in sophisticated tones or brash rhetoric, is more sinister and is a poison that needs a more strategic and well-thought-out tactical approach. This begins with education, defining what anti-Semitism is and isn't, and then labeling the perpetrators by their actions for what they are. As I said earlier, aggressively and early. This evening, you will be addressed by Dr. Mark Weitzman, one of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's experts on anti-Semitism. In many ways, you can say he wrote the book. He has worked with nations around the world, the US government, and the United Nations to accept not only a working definition of anti-Semitism, but also a description of its characteristics, so it cannot be manipulated. These are the benchmarks, and sometimes you need to test against benchmarks to be sure of what you're seeing. In my small part of the universe in Jersey City, a sad response to the Jersey City horror was made by an elected person that should have known better. My response was, what if something like that was said about the African American community, or the Muslim community, or the Latino community, or the gay community? What would the standard be? The same standard should be applied now, and it shouldn't be different because it's the Orthodox Jewish community. Listen carefully to Dr. Weitzman and build a diverse and meaningful trust in your community. One nation, indivisible. That concludes the mayor's remarks, Mayor Steve Fulop, and once again, personally, I'd like to thank everyone for their support and our elected officials for coming out tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi, very much.
Next, I'll introduce one of the coordinators and people very involved in the community forever, steps up whenever in a position calls for it. And this is no exception from it. Josh Brzezinski, many people know different roles in the community, very involved nationally, internationally, statewide, always looking to watch out for our community. We're very lucky to have Josh in our town, very lucky to have him as involved as he is. So, Josh Brzezinski, would you please come up?
Good evening, everyone. I'm standing on 3 platforms, and I hope you can still see me. Before I introduce our keynote speaker tonight, I want to first thank my fellow coordinators, Mark Colton and Michael Gordon, who have done an unbelievable amount of work. There you are. Unbelievable amount of work over the last, I would say, almost a year in bringing this issue to the fore and getting our community involved to see that things will work out for the best for every member of our community. So thank you to the 2 of you and the entire committee, John Kovac and others who are here with us tonight. Thank you all for all of your help and all of your work. It was an honor going to Israel with Assemblywoman Pinkin and her husband and her son, as well as other legislators from the state a few years ago. It was an eye-opening tour on all sides, the entire country, left to right, top to bottom, and she is a true friend of our community, and I really appreciate your being here on behalf of not only your constituents in your district, but also on behalf of the state legislature. Thank you. And I'd like to thank our mayor and council members for being here. It's an honor to work with you as well. As often as possible, try not to drive you too nuts, especially when it comes to other issues besides this one, which I sometimes get up and speak about in the town council, borough council. So thank you for your patience, and thank you for your help, and thank you for being here. My good friend, Agent Reggie Johnson from the prosecutor's office, also, it's an honor working with you in the past as well. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Tonight we have a very special speaker. He's world-renowned, he's internationally and world-renowned speaker on this very topic. I didn't know until we met. First, before I introduce him, I want to thank Michael Cohn, who's the East Coast Director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, for organizing this and making sure that we can get a person like Mark Weitzman to come here tonight. So thank you. He's not here yet. Michael will be here later. But thank you. You'll let Michael know that I thank him and his staff for all the work they have done to make this night possible. I didn't know until that phone call with Mark Weitzman that I actually was friends with his father-in-law. We davened in the same shul together in the Bronx. His wife was a colleague when I worked at the OU on advocacy. Elaine Weitzman of Frisch. And so, as internationally renowned as he is, he's also one of the local boys. So it's good, it's an honor to have you. Mark has a very distinguished resume and very distinguished biography. Mark Weitzman is Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center and is also Chief Representative of the Center to the United Nations in New York. He's a member of the official U.S. delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Authority, IRA, where he chaired the Committee on Anti-Semitism and Holocaust Denial, and is currently chairing the Working Group on Holocaust Museums and Memorials. He is described by the London Jewish Chronicle as the architect of IRA's 2016 adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism, which is the first definition of anti-Semitism with any formal status. He's also the lead author of IRA's working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, which was adopted by the 34 member countries of IRA in 2013, has been adopted by the United States, and most recently in the United Nations Special Rapporteur Report. Mr. Weitzman is a participant in the Program on Religion and Foreign Policy of the Council on Foreign Relations, served as a member of the advisory panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and co-chaired the Working Group on International Affairs of the Global Forum on Anti-Semitism. He is also a board member and former vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, and was member of the advisory board of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy at Yale University, as well as a longtime member of the official Jewish Catholic Dialogue Group of New York. In 2019, he was invited to be one of the founding board members of the International Organization of Anti-Semitism Research and the first academic society for the interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism. And now I'll begin his biography. Just getting started, folks. Mr. Weitzman has testified in the U.S. Congress, met with world leaders, several UN Secretary Generals, most recently Antonio Guterres, and has been a featured speaker at 3 UN conferences on anti-Semitism and extremism. He was one of the Jewish leaders to meet with Popes Benedict and Francis on their U.S. visits, and also had an audience with Pope Francis at the Vatican. Mr. Weitzman has presented at international political and scholarly conferences throughout North America, Europe, Israel, South America, Africa, and Australia. In 1996, Mr. Weitzman edited the textbook The Holocaust, Historical Case Studies, and in 1987 he was on the board of advisors for the companion guide for the film Shoah. In 2004, he was a contributor to the Encyclopedia of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity, and was a winner of the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for Best Anthology for Anti-Semitism, The Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal, to which he co-edited and contributed. His most recent publication is as author of An End to Anti-Semitism, a catalog of policies to combat anti-Semitism that was presented to the European Union last November. He also served as a member of the advisory expert group of the joint OSCE-UNESCO publication, Addressing Anti-Semitism Through Education, Guidelines for Policymakers. He has overseen the Wiesenthal Center's annual electronic report, Digital Hate and Terrorism, and is currently co-editing the Rutledge History of Anti-Semitism, scheduled for publication in 2020. And most importantly, he has been recognized for his work by the U.S. Army and the Negro League Baseball Museum. It's an honor for all of us here in Highland Park and Edison and our community to stand up and welcome this prestigious speaker, Mr. Mark Weitzman.
Everyone hear me with this mic that's supposed to be working, or did? Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to thank Josh very much for reading everything that I wrote for my mother. It's not again to put you all to sleep now.
Park here in the back. Can we, the mic's not picking you up.
Is this better? Okay. So as I said, I'm very grateful for that lengthy introduction. And that pretty much concludes the program in some ways. But nonetheless, I really appreciate everyone coming out here tonight. And I very much want to start by thanking the elected officials who've shown up. Assemblywoman, the mayor, the council members, representative from the prosecutor's office. It is really, I think, when I get to the end of my prepared remarks, you'll see how important it is for exactly what they did today by showing up. And I think that it's really illustrative of the bonds and the relationship that has been built over the years between the community and its officials that can serve as a model for many other places dealing with this issue in many different ways. I'd also like to express my thanks for the remarks from Jersey City Mayor Fulop, who has become something of really one of the standout figures and models of how to react and stay true to your heritage at the same time as embracing the ideals of the United States at large and serving as really a leader that all can relate to at a time of difficulty and tragedy and of a horrific incident. I'm going to begin, also I actually want to thank Rabbi Kaufman for opening up the shul as well, and the members of the committee who organized it. I think that's my list of those things. I want to begin tonight's remarks by answering a question that I'm frequently asked before I'm asked it tonight. And the question is generally, given the nature of the subject that I deal with, given the reality of what's going on, is very much, are we in a situation in the United States similar to 1930s Germany? Are we on the cusp of something, if not exactly the same, but something similar to what led to the Holocaust in Europe? And there are a lot of people who feel very strongly one way or the other. My answer to that question is going to be very direct. The answer is no. I don't accept that comparison. And I'll give you very quickly 6 reasons why, despite the anti-Semitism that we're facing today, and we're going to talk about it in more detail, but I wanted to get this out of the way first, in a way, that we are not in a 1930s situation. First, there is no history in the United States of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. There is clearly anti-Semitic violence in the United States, but there is no state-organized pogroms to the extent that existed in Europe prior to World War II. At the same time, there is no history in the United States of one single state-sponsored religion. While there certainly was an informal religious barriers put up against Jews in many ways, up till including the mid part of last century, where Jews were restricted and barred, but nonetheless, there was not one religion that was officially established as a state religion, and that the others were seen as secondary to. Third, Jews have always been able to fight back against anti-Semitism. And if we go back even to the colonial period, Jews were vigorous and active in opposing anti-Semitism. Fourth, anti-Semitism in the United States has always had to compete with other forms of bigotry because of the presence of indigenous population in the United States, Native Americans, as well as the importation of minorities through the slave trade, and later on, the immigrant populations, whether it was the Irish Catholic or whether it was Chinese, that were also viewed as inferior and subject to discrimination. Jews have not been the only ones singled out. Next, most Americans come from other places. If we trace our lineage back, even those who came on the Mayflower came from someplace else. And in most cases, they were fleeing or looking for better opportunities. And they were leaving behind bitter memories of the situations that they themselves had faced. And finally, anti-Semitism is foreign to the ideals, and I stress the ideals, not necessarily the reality, but the ideals that this country was founded on. So for those who wanted to embrace anti-Semitism, they could not find support in the official ideals of American structure of life. But, as I alluded to, that does not mean that anti-Semitism has not been present in the United States. Rabbi Kaufman mentioned that many of us, for many years, until the last few years, really did not have a strong visceral reaction or feeling about anti-Semitism in this country. And that's true. We went through, perhaps we could say, a golden period. But it doesn't, and we shouldn't, ignore the fact that anti-Semitism has been present in the United States even before there was the United States. If we go back to the founding of New York and Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch East India colonies, who did not want to allow Jews into New York at all, into New Amsterdam as it was called. And he wrote in 1654, and I'm reading his words, "The deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, be not allowed to further infect and trouble this new colony." Stuyvesant was also a racist, not just an anti-Semite. And he was overruled by his superiors, and Jews were allowed in, establishing the first presence in New York of Jewish life. But it had to be because Jews fought back and were able to overcome the words of anti-Semitism. And the presence of Jewish life in New York, as in the United States, has not always been smooth. And I'm not going to give you a whole history of anti-Semitism in the United States. If you thought the introduction was long, you can imagine how long that would be. But I will give you just another quote This is from a newspaper, from the New York Post actually. And it said, every Jewish resident had stories to tell of relatives or acquaintances beaten by gangs whose leaders almost invariably prefaced the attacks by demanding, "Are you Jewish?" A lot of people would say that. I took that quote from last month's New York Post. It was actually from 1944, from January 1944. And it was published in reaction to groups of marauding Catholic youth who were going around Jewish neighborhoods, such as Washington Heights, Flatbush, and the Bronx, attacking and vandalizing Jews and physically attacking them, to the point where Mayor LaGuardia, that time mayor of New York, had to appoint a commission to investigate. And the same thing happened in Boston. And another commission had to be appointed to investigate. So the problems that we see now, in many ways, are rooted in American history. They've always been a part of American history. And it continued. If we look to more recent times, from the late 20th century on, for the last 2-3 decades alone, I'm just going to give you some brief examples of hardcore anti-Semitic violence that in some ways we forgot about, or at least some of us did. In 1984, a Jewish talk show host, radio talk show host, was murdered in Colorado, in Denver, by members of a neo-Nazi group called the Aryan Nations. In 1986, a Hasidic man was murdered in Pittsburgh. In 1999, a white supremacist shot up Los Angeles JCC, killing 1 person and wounding 5. Same year, a member of another white supremacist group went from Indiana to Chicago, engaged in a shooting spree in which he wounded 9 Jews, murdered 2 African Americans, and 1 Asian American. In 2006, a Muslim extremist killed 1 and wounded 5 at the Seattle Jewish Community Center. In 2009, an 88-year-old white supremacist walked into the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, took out a shotgun, and murdered the African American security guard. And in 2014, another white supremacist murdered 3 non-Jews, Christians, at the Overland Park JCC in Kansas City in an attack that was motivated by anti-Semitism, only he mistook the victims for Jews. In 2018, another University of Pennsylvania student was murdered by neo-Nazis on the West Coast by a high school classmate because he was Jewish and because he was gay. So, the recent attacks seem to be a culmination, or seem to have built on something that was already present. What is the difference then? Why are we now so concerned? Why have we all come out here? And there is a difference. Even though anti-Semitism in the U.S. is not new, it's always been a part of the picture, but after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism was repudiated by the American mainstream and became politically and socially unacceptable. Those instances that I just mentioned, what they all had in common were that they were perpetrated by fringe figures, members of extremist groups or extremist ideologies, lone wolves, operating to a certain degree on their own. Sure, they had backgrounds. The 88-year-old shooter had been a member of neo-Nazi groups for years. The Overland Park shooter was first sentenced in the 1980s as part of a criminal riot perpetrated by neo-Nazis in North Carolina. They were not new, but they were all isolated on the fringes. Mention was made of social media. That has been a major part of changing the climate today. But it's not the only part. Because what we saw, if we begin by looking at the march in Charlottesville and the legitimizing of extreme anti-Zionist statements by members of Congress, signified a new openness to anti-Semitism in our political discourse. Murders in Pittsburgh, in Poway, California, Jersey City, the attack in Muncie, were the worst acts of anti-Semitic violence in the U.S., and they all flowed one after another. There were not 10 years gap between them. The gap was months in many cases. And they were incited. And incitement continues. Take one example outside of the United States. You're all familiar with the terrible murder in Christchurch, in New Zealand. The manifesto of that shooter is now being used online to inspire others to follow in his footsteps. Anti-Semitism, fueled by conspiracy theories, energized by social media, it has become a violent reality in a way that was unthinkable just a few years ago. I'm not much for statistics, but just a few. Anti-Semitic attacks doubled last year, and according to the FBI, nearly 60% of hate crime attacks in the United States were targeted against Jews and Jewish institutions. That's 60% of religiously motivated hate crime attacks. And in 2018, campus anti-Semitism rose by a reported 70%, and that figure continues to rise as we speak. Rabbi Kaufman alluded to it. Jewish life in the United States has changed quantitatively and qualitatively. We now look at security precautions and apparatus for all our buildings. Our children get used to going to school and passing through metal detectors and seeing armed guards on a regular basis. That was not present even just 10 years ago. It's a new reality. But the question then arises, if anti-Semitism is such an evil that has led us to that situation, what are the benchmarks, to use the word that was used earlier, of that anti-Semitism? How do we define it? What is anti-Semitism? And you could go in an academic route and you could spend a whole seminar dealing with definitions of anti-Semitism. One of the great medievals of the late 20th century, a Stanford professor named Gavin Longmire, who wrote on medieval anti-Semitism, actually called one of his books toward a definition of anti-Semitism. He wasn't ready, after a lifetime of work, to conclude that he had reached the exact definition. He was still working toward it. But the reality is that we don't live in an ivory tower. The attacks that we're talking about were real life and real time to real people. So for those of us looking and working at it, we began to realize that we had to go in a different direction. The academic work is important. And I do have a foot in that world as well. But it doesn't always translate into practical impact. So let me give you some examples that show you some of the confusion. Some of them are taken from the United States, some of them are not. So for example, in July 2014, in the middle of the Gaza war between Israel and Hamas, etc., in Gaza, a synagogue, a shul in Wuppertal, Germany, was firebombed. Literally, Molotov cocktails were thrown. Few people were arrested. That was not supposed to happen. There was a quote that I realized I wanted to use that I pulled out for that. But we won't use that. The synagogue was firebombed. 3 people were arrested and confessed. They were of Middle Eastern origin, and they said that they were energized by the war in Gaza. But they confessed, as I said, to the firebombing, to the arson attack, and they were brought before a court. The court's verdict was they did not commit a hate crime. It was protected political speech. Arson as a form of political speech. And then it was upheld by an appeals court. In 2015 in Austria, on a Facebook posting, a man of Turkish origin showed Adolf Hitler with a statement praising the death of Jews and encouraging others to follow through. The prosecutor refused to bring charges, saying he was just expressing, and I'm quoting now, his displeasure toward Israel. Was that anti-Semitism also? Not according to the prosecutor. Closer to home, in 2016, in a case that you're probably all familiar with, a professor from Rutgers gave a talk at Vassar in which she claimed that Israel is mining the organs of Palestinian children, an updated version of the discredited medieval blood libel. But she and her defenders said it wasn't anti-Semitism. Writing in her defense, a Jewish academic wrote, her claim that Israel harvested Palestinian body parts was irresponsible and unsubstantiated, but it wasn't anti-Semitism. As we used to say in Brooklyn, a distinction without a difference. And finally, last May, Louis Farrakhan, the bigoted leader of the Nation of Islam, gave a talk which referred to satanic Jews and at the same time denied that he was anti-Semitic. So none of those things apparently are anti-Semitism. And while we may say that the professor was operating beyond the realm of reality, and Farrakhan has been denounced and notorious for not just his anti-Semitism, but his homophobia and misogynism as well, nonetheless, we're left with the court decisions and the prosecutor decisions, and we realize that what is anti-Semitism is not just a theoretical question. So, let me give you some answers to what I think anti-Semitism is. And I'll try to go through fairly quick this part. First of all, anti-Semitism did not begin in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, and it did not begin at the beginning of the 20th century with the first Zionist Congress, or the end of the 19th century with the first Zionist Congress, but anti-Semitism is a long history. And I'm going to use 4 versions of the letter D to give you that history in about 4 minutes. So first of all, anti-Semitism began in the early days of the separation of Judaism and Christianity. It doesn't mean that anti-Jewish feeling did not exist before, but it wasn't necessarily motivated in the same way. That could have been political, that could have been national. There were tensions in the classical world between Jews and other religions and other groups, and it was a normal friction between people. But when we trace the origins of anti-Semitism, we generally trace it back to the beginnings of the separation between Judaism and Christianity. The paradigm that was used was that the Judaism at that time was degenerate, first letter D. As a result, according to the Christians, their Messiah came and was murdered by the Jews, an act of deicide. Following that, Jews were damned and finally dispersed into the diaspora. That paradigm, simple to remember with those 4 Ds, set the stage for the whole strain of medieval anti-Semitism that existed basically up until the Holocaust in many ways. How many of you remember looking at the pictures on television of the destruction of the cathedral by fire of Notre Dame last summer? You may not be aware that over the doors of Notre Dame are 2 statues. One showing the church triumphant, with the staff intact, looking up, vigorous. The other showing blindfolded synagogue, the synagogue, with the staff broken, shattered, inferior, because they had betrayed God's promise. The Jewish people had betrayed God's promise and deserved punishment. It was not just the language. Even the masterpieces of Western art, in many cases, reinforced those stereotypes. So that was the first form of anti-Semitism. The followers of the Enlightenment reacted against what they felt was overwhelming religious bigotry and narrowness, and they broke away from a more scientific worldview, but many of them, including Voltaire, felt that their rejection of the Christian Bible meant they had to reject the originators of the Bible, the Jews. And so they turned to their own anti-Semitism, based on their rational thought. That was the second. The third was the pseudoscience of the late 19th century that took Darwinism in a direction that Darwin never envisioned. It created a taxonomy of races, of racial superiority, cloaked in the pseudoscientific language that led to Nazi racial science. It also led to the science of the act of eugenics in the United States, which was a model for the Nazis, among other things. And the last was the socialism, the anti-Semitism of the left, beginning with Marx and others that viewed Jews or any religion as being too particular, as being part of the moneyed classes, the capitalist classes, and basically, in the classical Marxian term, viewed religion as the opiate of the peoples, and Judaism as one of the worst forms of religion. Those were the strands that led to the Holocaust. And after that, all of them, in many ways, especially in the West, were challenged. Racial anti-Semitism became pseudoscience, no longer accepted. The Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, re-examined their teachings, and in incredible acts of self-examination, moved in a totally different direction, challenging their own teachings of hate and contempt. Only the communist world kept up the anti-Semitism as a form of political propaganda and allied itself with the enemies of Israel and the enemies of the West. As a result, anti-Semitism had to look for a new venue to come out. If it was unacceptable in the traditional ways, it had to find a new form of acceptance. And that crystallized with the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. Because now you had a target that could legitimately, in their minds, serve as a receptacle for anti-Semitism. So you're no longer an anti-Semite, but you're an anti-Zionist. And the way this worked, essentially, and again, I'm trying to conflate, not to take too much time or detail, was that the anti-Zionism, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, became the focus of respectable anti-Semitism. To the point where the Israeli former prisoner, human rights prisoner of the Soviet Union, and political leader Natan Sharansky defined a new form of anti-Semitism that he also used the letter D to summarize, saying that if you end up demonizing the state of Israel or Jews through the state of Israel, if you apply a double standard, and if you delegitimize the existence of the state of Israel in comparison to any other country or any other group, then you have embraced the new anti-Semitism. So this is where we stood until about a decade ago, when a wave of anti-Semitism began hitting Europe first, that everyone was unprepared for. Cemeteries were vandalized, there was violence, and all of a sudden we realized, those of us working in the field, that while Sharansky had talked about this new form of anti-Semitism and given us sort of a metric for it, nonetheless, we were still in a position where people were looking only at the old form of anti-Semitism and basically saying if you didn't see a neo-Nazi behind it, it wasn't anti-Semitic. We had to come up with something else. And that's where I came into the picture, because in 2000, the Prime Minister of Sweden had, for various reasons, decided he wanted to have the very first conference, political conference of the new millennium, dealing with the Holocaust. So in January of 2000, representatives of over 50 countries, high level, heads of state, foreign ministers, and so on, got together in Stockholm, what was called the Stockholm Forum. And out of that, 5 countries initially, and then joined by others, now up to 34, created what is now known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The IHRA is a very interesting group. I've been a part of the US delegation to it since it began. And what's interesting about it is, first of all, it's the only international body, intergovernmental body, that deals specifically and only with the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Its agenda does not include human rights or economic issues or technology or any of the other things that are of vital importance. It deals only with the two things that I mentioned, Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And the delegation is political. It's a political body. To join it, countries that apply have to have a letter of application signed by either the head of state or foreign minister. And they have to commit to three things. They have to commit to opening all their World War II era archives, to creating a national day of commemoration, it could vary from country to country, in memory of the victims of the Holocaust from that country, and in putting education about the Holocaust into their national curriculum. That's the requirement. The delegations are mixed. They're headed, again, by a senior diplomat, usually foreign ministry level ambassador or something like that. And they're also composed of selected experts. So I've been, as I mentioned, as you heard, a member of the U.S. delegation since it began. And in the year 2008, we began working on something that took 5 years to get through. IHRA operates by consensus. Consensus in that world means that all the countries, all the members have to agree to something before it becomes officially adopted. If one chooses not to, it's blocked. And what we started working on was a definition, a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. Because we realized that this was a pressing issue that was directly related to our work, our mandate, and if we weren't going to do it, no one else was going to do it. Why was it so pressing? Holocaust denial had been around for a number of years. And in a highlight case in 2000, the British pseudo-historian David Irving sued the American historian Deborah Lipstadt and lost a major case in a British court where the judge ruled that he was effectively a neo-Nazi and an anti-Semite and a distorter of history. And that, while ruined his reputation and pushed Holocaust denial to the fringes of the world, except for Iran and a couple of places like that where it's still a major part of public policy, it nonetheless took out that form of anti-Semitism off the agenda, off the mainstream, but it opened up the door for people to play with other forms. And that included countries that, for example, did not deny that the Holocaust ever took place, but said that we had no part of it. It was just those Germans who were part of it. There were no local collaborators. There was no anti-Semitism in our country, and started distorting history for their own purposes. So we put together a working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion, and it took 5 years to get it through. Because we had to get every government to agree to it, and there were a few governments that presented major roadblocks. But we did. At the end of that period, in 2013, a couple of us looked at each other and said, well, we've achieved something that we never thought we'd achieve. It was a long, hard road. What do we do next? And the answer was, we need to address anti-Semitism. So we took a definition of anti-Semitism that had been around from 2004, but never had any formal status. We tweaked it a little, adopted it a little, moved it around a little bit, and it took 3 years, and then it was finally adopted in Bucharest in 2016. That is the IHRA working definition of Holocaust denial and distortion. I am not going to give you the whole definition because I will hold it up. Working definition of anti-Semitism. Because if I hold it up, you can see that it's 2 pages long. So I'm not going to give it to you. But it has a descriptive part followed by a number of examples. Some include examples related to the classical anti-Semitism that we spoke about. Others include examples related to Israel. So for example, if you accuse Israel of committing acts of genocide, such as the Nazis, that is a form of anti-Semitism because it is so far from the reality that the only way you could classify it is an intent, anti-Semitic intent. And it became what we thought was a highly successful achievement to be used by the IRA countries in their dealings with IRA. We didn't expect it to strike a chord the way it did. And a few months later, the United Kingdom announced that they were adopting it officially for their own government use throughout the United Kingdom. It's now been adopted by over 200 municipalities in the United Kingdom as well as other universities, a number of universities, and so on. The list of countries that have adopted it has continued to grow. It includes the UK, Israel, Austria, Romania, Germany, Bulgaria, Belgium, Slovenia, Sweden, Lithuania, Republic of North Macedonia, Netherlands, Slovakia, Moldova, Czech Republic, Hungary. Hungary was just past February. Canada, just past June. Luxembourg, also June. Greece, also this past November. France, December 2019. Cyprus, Italy, just a couple of weeks ago, January. Sweden, 21st of January. Uruguay, 27th of January. We're up to over 20 countries that have adopted it in North America and South America and Europe. In the United States, it has been adopted and posted on the State Department's website. The United Nations, the Secretary General drew positive notice to it a couple of years ago, and this past fall, in a report by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief on Anti-Semitism in the United Nations, he recommended that the UN adopt it for their use as well. The European Parliament adopted a resolution that calls on member states to adopt and apply the definition of anti-Semitism. And I could go on, but I will tell you that none of that pales to the fact that Wikipedia has called it the most widely adopted definition of anti-Semitism around the world. So we know it's highly successful if Wikipedia says so. But it is not without its detractors. And so one of the groups that has attacked it and targeted the most are those affiliated with the so-called BDS movement. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it is a movement that attempts to force people to withdraw support and participation and cooperation with the Israeli state, Israeli institutions, Israeli people, and sometimes Jews. The question arises if BDS is inherently anti-Semitic. So I'll tell you, in theory, it doesn't have to be. In practice, it's always been. And if you look at it, you will see that part of the reason is that it directly clashes with the IRA definition. So for example, BDS claims that Israel is committing active genocide against the Palestinians. That's exactly what IRA would call an anti-Semitic statement. And I have to tell you that one of the first things in the IRA definition, right after the description of anti-Semitism there, is the sentence, and I'm going to go back and read this because it's crucial. Criticism of Israel, similar to that level against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. It is the distinction, the double standard, where if the only country you're talking about boycotting, if the only country you're talking about divestment from is Israel, then there's a problem there. Muslims in France are treated terribly in many ways, as second-class or worse citizens, with economic and social discrimination rampant, and religious discrimination. But I've yet to see a call for boycotting French wines or cheese. And we can continue with other examples. So the target has been that the definition, precisely because of its success, has become a prime target. And initially, the claim was meant that it was meant to inhibit and criminalize anti-Israel protest and criticism. But as you heard, the definition does nothing of the sort. And then they claim that only the description part, not the examples, apply. I can tell you, being the person who introduced it and guided it through, and together with the Romanian diplomat who was chair of IRA at the time, we both can affirm, he unfortunately passed away 2 years ago, we can both affirm that the entire text is the entire definition. It is not separate. It's not pick and choose. That is the IHRA definition. And so we now see that the claims are laid out that it is un-American, that it targets one group of Americans unfairly, that it is something that is unconstitutional, and so on and so forth. The definition was cited by President Trump when he signed his executive order dealing with the protecting Jews on campus under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And if you read the executive order carefully, it is not a challenge to American freedom of speech because it is crafted very simply to refer to complaints of acts on campuses that need to be clarified whether they fall under the rubric of civil rights complaints or not, and the definition is to be used as the metric or one of the metrics for measuring that. It does not prevent anybody from saying what they want to say. It might set an example if someone is brought up after they committed an act that is judged to be anti-Semitic. But there's a very big distinction in American law between freedom of speech, which is highly protected, and the right to commit a civil rights infringement on somebody else. And the reason that President Trump had to bring it up and sign the executive order were two reasons, actually. One, because the preceding Civil Rights Act really was drawn in such a way that a lot of people read it as not to apply to anti-Semitism. It did not include religion, for example, as one of the protected categories. And this is where the definition of who is a Jew becomes tricky. Are Jews religion? They're atheist Jews. There are Jews who converted to other religions who claim still to be Jewish. Are Jews an ethnic group, a race? There are black Jews. There are Jews, Sephardic Jews. There are Jews of every skin color. And so on. So the categorization was very difficult. So by adding that, President Trump was trying to move the bars a little bit to make it wider as a protected class. But here's the other part. And I'm going to go back, so I'm going to start winding down now. The title of the talk tonight is The Evil Amongst Us. And while I think that most people, when you read it, thought of it as the evil in the United States and so on, and anti-Semitism, and you're right. There was another layer that I wanted to include in that. And that's the layer of us. And I want to get kind of political here in a non-political way. Because I want to show you and explain that part of the problem that we're dealing with now is when anti-Semitism becomes a political football. And that is where we're at in many ways, and that is part of the problem. So part of the reason that President Trump had to, or decided to make this executive order, was because the resolution that had been proposed to enact the exact thing that he was talking about doing, that he did in the executive order, which passed the Senate, I think almost unanimously bipartisan support, and had huge bipartisan support in the House, was actually held up in its initial reading and hearing by the Republican chair of the House Judiciary Committee at that time, who was no longer in the House. And the Republican leadership did not want to bypass him and move the bill around or over him. So what President Trump actually had to do was kind of make up for the roadblock that members of his own party had put in place. And my point with that is not to point fingers specifically, but I'm going to point fingers generally. And to tell you that anti-Semitism is a problem in both parties, in the right and the left. We hear about the squad, the 4 Democratic congresswomen who are all considered to be lumped together, and some of them have made outright anti-Semitic statements. Some have not. But at the same time, there were 4 Republicans who ran for Congress in the 2018 elections who were outright Holocaust deniers and anti-Semites and neo-Nazis. Both parties have problems. I quoted Sharansky before. I want to quote him again. And it was Sharansky who said, and this is something that he's not the only one, he just says it better than most of us do, that if you really want to do something about fighting anti-Semitism, then if you're on the right, begin to fight it on the right first. If you're on the left, begin to fight it on the left first. If you just point fingers at the other house, then you're not really fighting anti-Semitism. You're playing politics. And you're using anti-Semitism as a political tool. And that's not going to change anything. It's only going to make the situation worse. And we have to realize that not only is there anti-Semitism on the right and the left, but anti-Semitism is sometimes one of the few things that can bring together the extreme right and extreme left. And this is not new. Already in 2008, 2 quick examples. The former Attorney General of the United States, Ramsey Clark, who has been he left the Johnson administration, protested the Vietnam War, and has been protesting wars, etc., and American imperialism ever since, was invited to a conference organized by a radical Islamist professor in Baltimore, and he was joined on the platform there, photographed very happily with one of America's leading neo-Nazis and leading Holocaust deniers. One of the leading critics of Israel these days is another woman named Alison Weir, who is generally perceived as being on the left. And yet Weir's publications have been published by, again, Holocaust denial sources, neo-Nazi sources, and she has no problem in bridging that gap itself. More recently, when it came to BDS support, there was a couple of, well, let me put it this way. There was a resolution passed in Congress last year, an anti-BDS resolution, supported essentially by 16 congressmen voted against it, and women voted against it. And obviously some members of the squad did. And by the way, just to show you that we can't make generalizations, one of the members, Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, did not go with the others and voted in favor of the resolution condemning BDS. So she was not in lockstep with the others all the way through. But nonetheless, we find at the same time that as strong as the Republican Party has been in many cases on supporting Israel, and as strong as the Democratic Party has been in many cases on supporting Israel, that the fringes are pulling on the sides. And so we have people like Nick Fuentes, one of the organizers of the Charlottesville March, a leader of the Groyper movement, which is the extreme far-right movement that's trying to push the Republican Party in a more extremist direction, who has come out in favor of BDS, opposing BDS laws, and is pushing from the right with support, for example, from the columnist Michelle Malkin, who also opposed laws condemning BDS. And they make this strange world where they're on the same side as far-left anti-Zionists. And the glue that holds them together is the anti-Semitism manifested as anti-Zionism. So I want to conclude with a couple of thoughts. The late Nobel Prize winner, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, is said to have written that Jews died at Auschwitz, but anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. I was there in Auschwitz 10 days ago, January 27th, for the commemoration. And while I was there, one of the most moving statements was made by a survivor, and this is what I was planning on doing. And I lost it originally, but found it, who said, Marian Tursky, who said, well, I lost what you said. Now it's coming through in Polish. Do not be, and this is a quote, do not be indifferent in the face of historical lies. Do not be indifferent when you see the past being exploited for needs of contemporary politics. Do not be indifferent when any minority suffers discrimination. For it's the essence of democracy that the majority wields the power, but at the same time the rights of the minority must be respected. Auschwitz did not suddenly fall down on you from the skies. The ground for it was prepared for many years in advance. What Tursky is saying applies to all of us. Indifference is the crime that we all face and have to deal with. To fight anti-Semitism requires rejecting indifference. It requires commitment, it requires leadership, it requires political leadership, which cuts across political partisanship. The fight against anti-Semitism should always be bipartisan. That should not ever be a question. And there are positive initiatives that reflect that. Both the Senate and the House now have bipartisan task forces on anti-Semitism, co-chaired by Democrats and Republicans, by Jews and Christians, all active and engaging on the issue. The State Department has a special envoy on anti-Semitism that President Trump appointed. He's not the first president to appoint it. It goes back to the Bush administration. But it's vigorously speaking out against anti-Semitism around the world. There is an office, another special envoy on Holocaust issues at the State Department that represents us on these issues in dealing with other nations. At the United Nations, the voice of our representatives have been strong. And even in the United Nations, the report of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief that I cited earlier was noteworthy for how strong, how vigorous, how much moral passion was brought to the report that was authored by Dr. Ahmed Shahid. So there's a lot of allies and a lot of people willing to speak up. But it does require even more of an effort in today, given the challenges that we face. We have called for the appointment of a focal person by the administration to deal with this issue in the domestic front. There is no one person, one place, one address. Anti-Semitism today is addressed possibly Department of Justice, possibly Department of Education, maybe housing, maybe Homeland Security, and so on. We'd like to see one address to pull these strands together, where the community would know where to go. We'd like to see, and we've called for, and we're hoping for a congressional resolution very shortly, the creation of a special FBI task force to deal with anti-Semitism. One was created a couple of decades ago to deal with the arson attacks on black churches, and was notably successful in minimizing those attacks. The times demand that kind of vigorous response today. If we're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, We have to recognize that it exists both on left and right, in marginalized and affluent communities. It's not an occasion to point fingers and hurl accusations. It begins with an honest examination of those who we think are our allies and of our own houses. Today in America, Jewish life is as much under threat as Jewish lives. We don't want our children, or anyone's children, for example, choosing what university to attend based on how safe the campus is if they're visibly Jewish. We don't want to become like France, where the discussion now is not on the quality of Jewish life in France, but the viability, the existence, continued existence of Jewish life in France. We want to reach the ideals that George Washington famously said in his letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island in 1790. He said, "The government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it all on occasions of their effectual support. May the children of the stock of Abraham, who dwell in this land, continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid. May the Father of all mercy scatter light and not darkness upon our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy." Sharansky said, "Evil cannot be defeated if it cannot be recognized, and the only way to recognize evil is to draw clear moral lines." And I would add to that, and to have strong moral leadership and political leadership as well. That's the clarity and leadership that our founding father provided in 1790, and that's exactly the kind of leadership that I hope and pray, and I'm cheered by their presence here, of leaders who seem to be committed to that, but that they will provide to all Americans today. Thank you.
There'll be questions and answers right now. Michael, can you please address that?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Weitzman. We're going to take some, Dr. Wu, we're happy to take a couple questions to elaborate on the discussion you had. Once everybody sits down, then we'll raise your hand. And what I want to do is have someone take the microphone to the person, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Fantastically informative, amazing speech. But my question is, how are we to deal with, in the United States, as far as I'm concerned, my whole life, there's never been a perpetuation of anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism as is being done with like the so-called squad. They're elected officials. So we're looking to them for leadership, but I see a perpetuation in people like this being elected in our Congress. So you said like in 2018, you know, there were neo-Nazi, presidential, whatever. These people are here and they're in office and they have the power. So do we have a concern about this in the near future? How do we get rid of people like this? Do you see this worsening for anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism? How do we deal with this?
I'll give you, well, first of all, there's no question that we live in an incredibly polarized time, especially politically. I think that those of us who follow those things, those of us who are aware, I would say, I'm going to turn to the political experts here as well, that the conditions are probably different now than any time that we can remember, and probably I'm old enough to go back to the 60s, and they weren't exactly a picnic then either. But I think that the situation is much worse now. And part of that is because the boundaries have been stretched. There is more penetration of the mainstream on both sides by extremists. There's been more legitimization of extremist discourse in politics. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need the political leadership that I kept referring to basically stand up and say that we will not tell you that you can't say these things, but we can say that you don't represent us, our party, our country, or our people. And beyond that, I think it is important to keep two things in mind. One is that the democratic process works in a lot of different ways, and these people can be challenged in their own districts. Their talk, and some of them are going to face challenges already. Some of them will try for higher office, and that's again where they have to be repudiated. But I will say point I made earlier about Presley was very interesting, because even with the squad, there are distinctions between them. Some are hardcore, some, or at least one person, seems to be open to hearing a different message. I don't know what the eventual future would be, but I think that one of the things that we have to realize is that if we can successfully turn someone away from a path of extremism, then that in itself is a victory. And we should lose no effort, or leave no stone unturned to make that effort. But again, this is a political world that we live in. And reference was made to the world of social media. That exacerbates the issue. It makes it worse. I think one of the problems that we have is that, and many organizations and institutions are trying to deal with the tech companies who have seemed to have gotten totally out of control in many ways. And again, we have never called for government censorship. And I'm in meetings with Facebook, and we have a relationship with Google and other companies directly, where we will flag things and bring it to their attention. And there's improvement on many of these companies. Facebook, for example, has improved in really in some significant ways. On the question of Holocaust denial, for example, it's highly problematic still with them. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't seem to see that is a problem. But I think that under congressional pressure, they're beginning to change their course as well. And what we're finding is that really what we've all been talking about is making them live up to their own terms of agreement, which is private contractual agreement and is not related to government censorship. So again, we are trying to do things that will have an impact, hopefully, on the basic level of political discourse. But we have to reject those who are trying to, both from within this country and from outside this country, who are trying to turn our political process into a political sewer.
Thank you. Can you provide some more insights on how the right and left are adopting each other's tactics and/or propaganda to treat anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, globally and in the United States?
I'm not sure, you want examples of how they're using anti-Semitism or how we're dealing with them? I'm not sure which question.
Dealing with them. Dealing with them.
Okay, so one of the things that we've done, one of the things I was trying to show here, for example, in certain cases, is that there are some people who claim to be motivated by high ideals, particularly, and it's kind of a myth on some levels, but particularly from the left. There was a sense that if someone is anti-racist or a member of a minority community, they can't be prejudiced at all with privilege. And we privilege suffering in many ways, and there's certainly a reason why we did, because I don't think there's any question that when we establish a system in this country and in the world of a structure that was often meant to keep people down in certain positions, and there is reason to try to give helping hands to raise people to equal status. But at the same time, there are those who've used that and who've said that if you once suffered, you can't turn around. And we see that in our own community. There's no question that there have been people who have used the Holocaust in a way of saying that because my grandparents went through something, you can't accuse me of being anything, being X, Y, and Z. That's just the reality. And one of the things that we need to do is really to expose and have people stand behind what they stand and be judged on what they stand and do for themselves. It is a matter of individual responsibility. I think one of the things that thought was one of the best uses of the definition happened in the United Kingdom 2 years ago, when it forced Jeremy Corbyn and members of the Labour Party to really take a position on the question of anti-Semitism and the definition. Are you in favor of it? Do you agree with it? Why not? And then they had to answer their constituents. It's that type of individual responsibility, not a group defamation, but an individual responsibility that we're talking about. So I think in this case, in some of the cases, if we find somebody who is making a claim to be an anti-colonialist, anti-racist, or whatever, and making exaggerated claims about Israel on that purpose, and then showing that the arguments they're using, the tropes that they're using, come from, for example, Nazi sources or neo-Nazi sources, and the materials being shared and recycled, tweets are being reposted and retweeted, and so on and so forth, it shows that their perspective is not an honest critic, because honest criticism should always be welcome. But it is meant and coming from a much darker place. And I think that's the important thing.
I just want to say thank you so much for the education for tonight. I've learned a lot. I've been learning a lot for the past couple of months, but thank you so much. I really do appreciate the knowledge, the wealth of knowledge that you share. And one of the concerns that we have seen lately is that the African American community and the Jewish community have gotten along really well in the past. And as of lately, the past couple of years, we've seen more friction. We can point to places in Brooklyn where we see more attacks on Jewish people. And my question is the education. I had the privilege to sit here tonight and for the past couple of months to learn a lot and to read and to educate myself. And with great speakers coming to talk about this, how can we get it to the African American community to let them see that not only do we have a shared past, and not only do we have the shared oppression, but we need to learn from each other and to live in community with each other.
I think those might be the wisest words I've heard all night. I'm going to say something that may be a little radical in a way here. You talked about the past, the shared past. And I think that sometimes, and I'm saying this as a person who, in many ways, was shaped by the words and actions, for example, of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Dr. King in Alabama, and so on. But I think that one of the mistakes that we make today is dwelling too much on that past. That was 50 years ago, over 50 years ago. None of us here, I think, marched in Alabama. Even John Lewis is retiring. And I think that we need to recognize that the communities are not the communities that they were then. We need to reshape it. And that requires a lot of work because it means letting go of some of our cherished memories and really being open to listening, not what happened and what was, but what's going on now. And I think that that openness is what's necessary. I think there are a lot of stereotypes that still persist. I mean, you've heard them, I've heard them, we've probably all heard them. It's getting beyond those stereotypes. And I think when we lecture sometimes and talk about this past of marching together, it's a way of evading the present and avoiding dealing with the present. And I think that we need to learn from the past, to cherish those leaders and models and walk in their footsteps, but with our own feet. And I'm going to suggest that that may be a place to start, is to recognizing that we have this past, we have the shared history of oppression, as you mentioned, of leaders who are able to reach out, but we have to chart it again in our generation. There's an old teaching that we say, Jews say every Passover. On every generation, it's incumbent upon us to feel as if we were the ones redeemed from Egypt. It means we have to relearn the lesson over and over again. We can't just sit back and say, 2,000 years ago, or whatever, Moses led us out of Egypt. It means that the holdover door to every generation, we have to do it ourselves again. And I think we're at that point where we recite the tale, we have the Seder, it's branded in our memory, but we're the ones who have to do the walking today. So that's where I would begin.
Do you see, given the polarization that you've mentioned, do you see any possibility currently within government, especially the federal government, behind the scenes, political leaders getting together and stopping to point the fingers at each other, but starting to say, you know what, this is a global problem, and you have to call everybody out, not just the members of a party? Do you see anything happening, or are people still going to say, they're the ones?
No, I mean, yes, I do see that happening in certain cases, and that's why I wanted to mention, and I could have spent more time on it, but I'll highlight it again. The fact that there are joint task forces in both the Senate and the House that are bipartisan, made up of Democrats and Republicans, Jews and non-Jews, and so on, who focus specifically on this issue. They're literally a joint task force on anti-Semitism. And I'm in almost weekly, if not daily, contact with them, and there are resolutions and acts and questions going to our ambassadors. And every year the State Department has to do an annual report on religious freedom mandated by Congress and delivered every year. And there's a section, every country, the report for every country has to be filled out by the State Department personnel, the embassy personnel or whatever, on the status of anti-Semitism in that country. So there is involvement. The problem is that we need to make sure that it stays bipartisan, that we need to be able to come together and to change it from, at this point, most of it is on the resolution side, into action.
But do these joint commissions look at each other? Do they look at the members of the Senate and the House of both parties and say, we have to address, we have to do something about it. We can't just sit and make some...
Fair question, good question. Okay, so the House one is a little bit more active in that. They do it a little more quietly, but they've taken stands on certain things. The Senate is really brand new. The Senate Task Force began, I think, this past November or so. And so far, they're concentrated on building their coalition. They're concentrating on building their coalition and looking for things that, that can build up rather than being divisive. But I have confidence that they will get there in time.
Thank you for your history and definition of the IRA anti-Semitism definition that includes the examples. But I continue to hear people questioning why Israel is included in the definition. It's a geopolitical issue. It's not a U.S. anti-Semitism definition. Can you talk about why here in the U.S. and New Jersey we should be including Israel in the definition?
Okay. Well, first of all, the definition was not meant as a U.S. definition. It's an international definition. The definition, let me give you a little bit of background about the definition. You'll see where we're coming from. The definition came from the expert community in IRA. In other words, there are experts from approximately 30 countries. Now, most of these, overwhelming number, are not Jewish, first of all. Israel is only one of the 34 countries that are members, so they're not Israeli either. They come from the Baltics, the Balkans, Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, South America, the United States, Canada, and so on. And we had these experts coming together and sitting at tables and talking about these issues and trying to work on it. And they also come from different disciplines. They're historians, educators, museums, memorials people, and government officials. Senior level diplomats, some in education, some in foreign education ministries, some in foreign ministries, etc. And we quickly realized, or not so quickly, because we're not as smart as we think we are sometimes, but we realized that we are not necessarily all talking about the same thing when we use the term. So if we're talking and we use the term anti-Semitism without a metric that's clearly understood, what I consider anti-Semitic is not necessarily what someone else considers anti-Semitic. And this is not the only item we had to thresh out. We had to deal with it even in terms of some of the questions about the Holocaust. There are different national conceptions of what the Holocaust was or who the victims were, things like that. So there's a series of things that this is a part of. It was driven by the experts. without a political agenda in mind. And then, when we realized it could be useful, we took it up to the political agenda for adoption, political level for adoption. And as you heard, I mentioned that I was honestly, frankly, surprised how much traction it's gained afterwards. Not displeased, pleasantly surprised. But it was clear that we were not the only ones thinking in that direction. So there is a need for something that's not academic, that's not necessarily legal, it's technically, we consider it a non-legally binding working definition. It establishes grounds for education, for moral and political leadership. It puts something on a plane, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's got that kind of traction and that kind of ground is because it answers the need that people feel right now. How do we talk about anti-Semitism in a way that we can all understand what we're talking about and not go splintering off in 20 or 30 different directions? So that's where it came from. Israel is not the focus of it. The Israeli examples, or the examples relating to Israel, were specifically related to issues of anti-Semitism. We did not discuss Israeli policy at all. Actually, BDS is not even mentioned in it. And there are other forms of examples that we could have used that didn't put in. We just took some sample represented ones. But the idea was to have something that dealt and answered the need and the necessity that we felt at this given time.
We're going to have, thank you. We're going to have one more question. If the doctor would stay around for maybe informally, but it's getting late and we want everybody.
Over here.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Just a quick two-part question. To what degree do you see the growth of intersectionality as being a problem, and how it relates to anti-Semitism in the United States? Is it a major factor? Is it a cover-up? Is it something that we have to be concerned with? And number two, if one takes a look at the recent anti-Semitism that's hit Europe, first of all, Europe, obviously, there was a very thin veneer that protected the anti-Semitics from coming out, and once you scratch that, it came out very quickly. And I think you can sort of trace a lot of the recent anti-Semitism in Europe to the influx of refugees that have come in from Muslim countries, in Germany and France and in England, just to name a few. The anti-Semitism seemed to spike with the growth of those communities. In the United States, it's quite possible that we may have a large influx of additional refugees and the possibility of additional anti-Semitism coming from that. So to what degree do you see the growth in anti-Semitism tied to the growing influx of people from Muslim countries that have been coming to the country, not from a racist perspective, but just from, how do you see that affecting anti-Semitism? Is it something that you see as having a correlational impact? And to what degree do you see that potentially happening in the United States as that community grows over time and they exert additional political influence?
Okay, so two questions. The first question about intersectionality, I'll just say that anything that in any way aids the growth of anti-Semitism is a matter of concern, and I think should be a matter of concern. Intersectionality, the sense that all things are linked and have this effect and impact on each other. So one act of discrimination could lead or creates other equal victims and so on. Yeah, it's certainly used by anti-Semites in some ways. It can also be used by people fighting anti-Semitism as well, by showing that an act that impacts one minority community, in other words, Jews, is also an act that impacts other minority communities. So you can turn around and flip it. At this point, intersectionality, as the form of anti-Semitism exists, it is not the major center or driver of anti-Semitism in the U.S. The second question about refugees. So first of all, I'm not sure if I agree totally with what you said. There is anti-Semitism in some parts of the Muslim community, refugees that have come in from outside of Europe. The German government, for example, is starting an initiative to try to educate refugees about the dangers of anti-Semitism, about how it should not be acceptable in the European context. But at the same time, a huge amount of the anti-Semitism in Europe is still driven by traditional, what we would say, far-right concerns. And sometimes the Jews and Muslim communities are even targeted together as in the drives to outlaw kashrut, the shechita, kosher slaughter, and circumcision, milah, which has happened in many European countries, from France to the UK to the Scandinavian countries, to the Netherlands, etc. And both religious communities are equally targeted. So I would say that there is there certainly is a presence of it in segments of the communities, of the immigrant communities. And sometimes, by the way, it's not the first generation, not the immigrants themselves, but it's their children. In France, this has been a particular issue, where the children who are facing the discrimination and the dead position that their parents had been put into became radicalized after having lived in France because of their treatment in France. So it's a little bit of a complicated situation. In the United States, there is no question that statistically, most of the anti-Semitic violence has been committed by what we would say domestic terrorists, Native American, not Native American as in the indigenous population here, but people born in the United States and not part of the refugee community. Does it exist? Absolutely. Is there anti-Semitic extremism that is being taught in certain segments of radicalized Islam? Absolutely. Does it represent the majority of Muslim refugees and people living in the United States? There is absolutely no evidence that it does.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I want to also acknowledge Councilwoman Stephanie Mchohan, who showed up. Thank you very much. I knew you had a meeting you left for. Also, Andrew Chair, Executive Director of Hillel at Rutgers. Thank you very much. And again, thank all the council members, Assemblywoman in the Prosecutor's Office. We know you take this seriously. We've had many conversations, and I do appreciate you coming tonight. I'm going to now introduce Mark Colton. Just say some closing remarks, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of you who came out this evening. Anti-Semitism can be defined as Jews, but for Jews, it hits us as a heart and soul issue. We've been called the wandering Jews, not because we wanted to wander, but for 2,000 years we've been forced to wander. I'm a second-generation American, and I thought the wandering is over. Those who migrate to the United States, UK, France, Argentina, other countries, have been found a secure home, thought they found a secure home. Yet we're here today because a trigger has been pulled, and Jews are asking, do we need to wander once again? Some say we should address anti-Semitism as a U.S. issue, anything else is geopolitics. However, like coronavirus, anti-Semitism can't be limited to one country. We have an opportunity to create the right anti-Semitism resolution in Highland Park, and hopefully we can successfully work together to make that happen. As Mayor Phillips said, we need to call it out aggressively. We're here tonight to be united against anti-Semitism. Thank you.